It was the kind of road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, winding through a dense, ancient forest. Claire, a photographer, had taken a detour off the highway in search of the perfect shot. She had a knack for finding beauty in desolation, and the idea of capturing the haunting beauty of the forest at night thrilled her. But as the last traces of sunlight faded, the thrill was replaced with an unsettling silence. Her car's headlights carved weak tunnels through the fog that seemed to grow thicker with every mile. The trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky, stood like silent sentinels. The radio had long since given up its signal, and the only sound was the soft hum of her tires against the damp road. The road forked suddenly, with no signs to guide her. Claire hesitated, but chose the narrower path, drawn by the strange compulsion to see where it led. The further she drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her high beams. Claire slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It was a man, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He wore old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in sepia-toned photographs, and his posture was unnervingly still. She honked, but he didn't flinch. Reluctantly, Claire rolled down her window just enough to shout, "Do you need help?" The man tilted his head as if considering her question, before raising one hand to point down the road. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Claire's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but the rational part of her brain reasoned he might need help. She eased the car forward, inching past him. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline. In her rearview mirror, the man stood motionless, watching her until the fog swallowed him. She continued, her unease growing with each passing second. The road became rougher, the trees more twisted. Then she saw it, an old house, its windows glowing faintly with an amber light. The sight was almost a relief, a sign of civilization. As she pulled into the overgrown driveway, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel loud in the oppressive silence. The air smelled damp and decayed, and the house loomed like a specter against the night sky. The door creaked open before she could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed too large for her skull. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered. I just need directions," Claire stammered. The woman stepped aside, gesturing for Claire to enter. Against her better judgment, Claire crossed the threshold. The interior was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, casting shadows that seemed to dance independently of the flames. The walls were lined with photographs, all of them black and white portraits of stern-faced people. As Claire's eyes adjusted, she noticed something chilling. They were all staring directly at her. "You're not safe here," the woman said abruptly. "It's already seen you." "What's already seen me?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. Before the woman could answer, the lamps flickered violently, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the house. The air turned icy, and the shadows on the walls began to writhe like living things. The woman grabbed Claire's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You need to leave. Now." Claire bolted for the door, but as she reached it, the house seemed to shift around her. The doorframe stretched, the walls closed in, and a deafening roar filled her ears. She turned back to see the woman standing in the center of the room, her face contorted in terror. "They won't let you go," the woman screamed, her voice distorted as if it came from underwater. Suddenly, Claire was outside, stumbling toward her car. She didn't remember running, but there she was, fumbling with her keys. She glanced back at the house and froze. The woman was in the window, her mouth open in a silent scream. Behind her, a shadowy figure loomed, its elongated limbs impossibly thin and sharp, its eyes glowing like hot coals. Claire didn't wait to see more. She jumped into her car and sped down the road, her breath ragged, her heart hammering. The fog seemed to part for her, but the forest felt alive, as if it were watching her flee. When she finally reached the highway, the relief was overwhelming. She pulled over, gasping for air, and dared to look in her rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty, but her reflection wasn't alone. The man with the hat sat in her back seat, his eyes glowing like embers. The last thing she heard before everything went black was his voice, low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have come." The clock in the corner of the room struck midnight, its chime echoing through the cavernous mansion like a ghostly whisper. Lisa, an amateur paranormal investigator, had come to the infamous Blackthorn Manor, a crumbling relic of a bygone era shrouded in tales of tragedy and disappearances. She thought she was ready for anything, armed with her camera, recorder, and bravado. But she was wrong. The house had been abandoned for decades, yet it felt alive. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something sharper, metallic. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple as if breathing. As Lisa made her way down the grand hall, her flashlight flickered. "Cheap batteries," she muttered, though her voice sounded too loud, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. She stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. Lisa aimed her flashlight at it and felt her stomach knot. The beam illuminated not just her reflection, but something behind her, a shadowy figure that shouldn't be there. It was tall and distorted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Lisa spun around, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The hallway was empty. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to suppress the rising panic. She turned back to the mirror, only to see her own reflection staring at her, grinning. But she wasn't smiling. Her breath hitched as her reflection raised a hand, its fingers bending backward with grotesque cracks, and pointed toward the staircase behind her. A low, guttural growl emanated from the mirror, vibrating through her bones. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight, and turned toward the stairs. She knew she should leave, but an inexplicable compulsion drove her forward. Each creak of the wooden steps felt like a heartbeat, quickening as she climbed. At the top of the stairs was a door, slightly ajar. The faint sound of a music box drifted out, its eerie melody a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet. Lisa hesitated, but felt drawn to the room as if an invisible hand were pulling her. The room was a nursery, untouched by time. Dust motes floated in the beam of her flashlight, and a small wooden crib sat in the center of the room. The music box rested on a nearby dresser, its handle turning on its own. Lisa approached cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to leave. As she reached out to stop the music box, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to coalesce, pooling together like ink. The crib began to rock slowly, creaking on its ancient hinges. Lisa's heart thundered in her chest as she shone her flashlight on it. Inside the crib was a doll, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. The doll's remaining eye swiveled to meet hers. Lisa froze as the shadows in the room began to take shape, forming a hunched figure with elongated limbs. It emerged from the corner, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The figure lunged, and Lisa screamed, bolting from the room. The nursery door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Blood. But the thing wasn't far behind. She could hear it, wet, dragging footsteps and the sound of claws scraping against the walls. She tore down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. As she reached the front door, it slammed shut, the lock twisting on its own. Desperate, she pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A voice, low and raspy, whispered in her ear, "You're already mine." Lisa turned, pressing her back against the door. The figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, its head tilted as if curious. It began to crawl toward her, its joints cracking with each grotesque movement. In a last-ditch effort, Lisa hurled her flashlight at it. The beam shattered on impact, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, its weak light barely illuminating the nightmare before her. And then, everything went silent. When the police arrived the next day, responding to the panicked call of a neighbor who'd heard screams in the night, they found the front door of Blackthorn Manor wide open. The house was empty, save for Lisa's camera lying on the floor in the nursery. The last photo it had captured was a blurry image of Lisa's terrified face, her mouth open in a scream, as a pair of clawed hands reached for her from the shadows. No trace of Lisa was ever found. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield of David's car as he navigated the desolate country road. He'd been driving for hours, the isolation pressing in on him like a physical weight. The GPS had lost its signal miles back, leaving him to rely on instinct and the occasional rusted road sign. Then, he saw it, a figure standing by the roadside, drenched but unmoving. The beam of his headlights revealed a young woman in a white dress, her long black hair plastered to her face. David hesitated, but guilt overrode caution. He slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman didn't speak, but nodded slowly. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like. David unlocked the door, and she slid into the passenger seat without a word. Her skin was pale, her lips a faint shade of blue, and her eyes seemed to stare through him rather than at him. "Where are you headed?" David asked, trying to sound casual. She pointed straight ahead, her hand trembling. He nodded and resumed driving, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the rain and the faint creak of the woman's wet dress against the seat. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. David stole glances at her, trying to make sense of her eerie silence. Then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Her feet were bare, but they were clean, free of mud or water, despite the storm outside. "Were you waiting out there long?" he asked, his voice strained. The woman turned her head slowly to face him, her lips parting as if to speak. Instead, she let out a low, guttural moan that sent shivers racing down his spine. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, ice cold and unyielding. David yelped and jerked the wheel, the car swerving violently. He pulled over, heart pounding, and yanked his hand free. When he turned to confront her, the passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked. Breathing heavily, he searched the road behind him with his flashlight. Nothing. He climbed back into the car, convincing himself that the stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on him. As he continued driving, the rain seemed to ease, but his unease only grew. The road ahead stretched into the horizon, eerily identical to the one behind him. He began to notice peculiar details, the same gnarled tree, the same rusted mailbox, passing again and again. A sinking realization hit him. He was driving in a loop. Desperate, he sped up, but the road remained the same. Then, out of nowhere, his headlights illuminated her again. The woman in white, standing in the middle of the road. This time, David didn't slow down. He swerved to avoid her, narrowly missing her figure, but when he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was sitting in the back seat, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Why won't you leave me alone?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Her lips twisted into a chilling smile, and she whispered, "You picked me up." The radio crackled to life, static filling the car. Over it, he could hear faint voices, screams, cries for help, and something that sounded like his own voice calling out in terror. The woman leaned forward, her face inches from his, her breath cold against his skin. "You can't leave," she said. "Not until they're done with you." The car's engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering out. David was plunged into darkness. He fumbled for his phone, its weak flashlight casting a feeble glow. The last thing he saw was her face, impossibly close, her mouth stretching wide into a void of darkness filled with rows of jagged teeth. The next morning, the car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, but the back seat was soaked, as if someone had sat there in drenched clothes. The only clue was a single wet handprint on the inside of the windshield, smeared as if it had been dragging down. David was never seen again. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as Elena approached the cabin deep in the woods. It was her grandmother's, or at least it had been, before her sudden and unexplained disappearance last winter. The authorities had searched for weeks, but all they found were her grandmother's knitting needles left abandoned on the porch. No footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing. Elena had returned to sort through her grandmother's things, a task she dreaded but felt obligated to complete. The cabin was eerily quiet, the surrounding forest devoid of bird song or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. The key slid into the lock with a reluctant groan. As the door swung open, a gust of stale air greeted her, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender, her grandmother's favorite. But beneath it was something else. Something metallic, sharp, and wrong. The cabin looked untouched, as though her grandmother had simply stepped out for a moment. A pot sat on the stove, its contents long since turned to mold. Her knitting lay half-finished on the armrest of her rocking chair. Elena shivered, the feeling of being watched creeping up her spine. The first strange thing happened as she unpacked her bag. She set her phone on the table and turned to place her coat on a hook. When she turned back, the phone was gone. She searched the room, increasingly frantic, but it was nowhere to be found. It didn't make sense. She hadn't even heard it fall. As night fell, Elena lit the fireplace, hoping its warm glow would banish the unease that had taken root in her chest. She sat in the rocking chair, running her fingers over her grandmother's knitting needles, the smooth wood worn from years of use. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate, and came from the back of the cabin, the side without a door. Elena froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The knock came again, louder this time. She grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the back window. Peering out, she saw nothing but the dense darkness of the forest. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. When she turned back to the room, the rocking chair was moving, creaking slowly as if someone had just risen from it. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Elena's breath quickened as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Frost began to creep across the windows, and the fire in the hearth sputtered and died. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, too low to make out, but unmistakably coming from inside the cabin. She spun around, flashlight sweeping the room. The beam landed on her grandmother's mirror above the fireplace. For a split second, Elena saw her reflection, but it wasn't her. The thing in the mirror wore her face, but its smile was too wide, its eyes too dark. It tilted its head and raised a hand to wave. The flashlight flickered and the figure in the mirror was gone. But the whispering grew louder, surrounding her, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elena bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock, which she hadn't touched, had twisted itself shut. She grabbed a chair, intending to smash the window, but the glass wouldn't break. It was as if the cabin had sealed itself, trapping her inside. The whispering stopped, replaced by a single low voice that seemed to vibrate through her skull. She never left. Elena turned slowly. The rocking chair was moving again, faster now, almost violently. The air around it shimmered, and a figure began to take shape. It was her grandmother, or at least something wearing her grandmother's form. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Elena," it rasped, its voice layered with something deep and guttural. "You came home." Elena stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face. The figure rose from the chair, its movements jerky, unnatural. It reached out, bony fingers elongating as they stretched toward her. She screamed as the lights flickered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The next day, when the neighbors came to check on her, the cabin was empty. Her car was still parked outside, her belongings untouched. The only sign she had been there was the rocking chair, still swaying gently, and her phone lying on the table displaying a single new photo. It was of Elena, standing in the doorway, smiling a wide, unnatural grin, her eyes as black as the night. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, and the wind howled through the skeletal trees as Mark pulled into the driveway of the old farmhouse. He had inherited the property from an uncle he barely knew, and while the thought of a free home was enticing, the place had an ominous reputation. Locals called it Hollow Hill, and stories of disappearances and strange events surrounded it like a storm cloud. Mark wasn't superstitious. He chalked the rumors up to small-town folklore and set to work cleaning the neglected home. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, and the wooden floors groaned underfoot as if protesting his presence. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the windows were so grimy they barely let in any light. As the day wore on, he discovered something odd. Every mirror in the house was missing. Frames hung empty on the walls, and shards of broken glass littered the attic. It was strange, but not enough to spook him. Maybe his uncle had a thing against mirrors, he thought. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Mark lay in bed, struggling to sleep. The farmhouse creaked and groaned in the darkness, the sounds too deliberate to be dismissed as the settling of an old house. Then he heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from the walls. He sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, moving along the wall as if something inside was trying to get out. "Rats," he muttered, though his voice trembled. He resolved to call an exterminator in the morning and forced himself to lie back down, but sleep wouldn't come. The scratching stopped, replaced by something worse, a low, wet whisper. It was indistinct at first, but soon he could make out words. "Let us in." Mark shot out of bed, fumbling for his flashlight. He shone it across the room to have illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the empty doorway. The whispering ceased, but the room felt colder, heavier. He decided to investigate, grabbing a crowbar from the toolbox he'd brought. Following the sound, he found himself in the living room, standing before an old fireplace. The bricks looked newer than the rest of the house, as if they had been hastily placed over something. A sense of dread pooled in his stomach, but curiosity won out. He pried at the bricks, each one coming loose with a sickening crunch. As the last brick fell away, he revealed a small, dark cavity. Inside was a mirror, its surface marred with black streaks as if it had been burned. Mark lifted it out, shivering as his fingers touched the cold, smooth surface. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the mirror cleared, and he saw something moving within its reflection. It wasn't him. The figure in the mirror was impossibly thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It tilted its head, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then it moved, a quick, jerky motion, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass as if trying to push through. Mark dropped the mirror, but it didn't shatter. Instead, it landed upright, its surface rippling like water. The figure began clawing at the inside, and the whispering returned, louder now, echoing through the room. "Let us out." The house shook. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder with each passing second. Shadows poured out of the mirror, twisting and writhing like living smoke. They filled the room, circling Mark as he backed into a corner. One shadow broke away from the rest, taking on a vaguely human shape. It reached out with elongated fingers, its touch icy and suffocating. Mark screamed, the sound swallowed by the shadows that engulfed him. The next morning, the farmhouse stood silent and empty. A passing neighbor noticed the front door ajar and called the sheriff. Inside, they found no trace of Mark, only his flashlight lying on the floor and a mirror leaning against the wall. The mirror's surface was pristine, save for one detail: Mark's reflection trapped inside, his face frozen in a silent scream. The storm began just as Emma reached the edge of Hollow Creek Forest. She had heard the warnings from locals, stories of people who entered the woods and never came back, but she dismissed them as old wives' tales. She was an urban explorer, drawn to the abandoned chapel rumored to be hidden deep within the forest. Its history intrigued her. A congregation that vanished overnight, their final sermons scrawled in blood on the chapel walls. Armed with her camera and flashlight, she pushed forward, the rain turning the dirt path into a slick, treacherous trail. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The towering trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. After what felt like hours, she found it. The chapel. Its roof sagged, and its wooden doors hung askew, barely attached to their rusted hinges. The structure seemed to lean toward her as if it had been waiting. She stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting her like a physical force. Her flashlight revealed rows of broken pews and shattered stained glass littering the floor. The altar was covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood, their meanings lost to time. Emma's breath caught as she noticed something else. A journal lying on the pulpit, its leather cover cracked and worn. She picked it up carefully, flipping through pages filled with frantic scrawls. Most of the writing was illegible, but one phrase appeared over and over: "He watches from the trees." A sudden thud echoed through the chapel, making her jump. She spun around, flashlight shaking, but saw nothing. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was the storm's muffled roar outside. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind or a falling branch, but then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from the back of the chapel. She followed the sound reluctantly, her steps slow and deliberate. The tapping led her to a door she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a broken pew. It was small, more like a trapdoor than anything else. Her curiosity burned brighter than her fear as she pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Emma hesitated, the air seeping from the opening cold and thick, almost tangible. She descended slowly, her flashlight struggling to cut through the oppressive blackness. The steps creaked under her weight, each one sounding like a warning. At the bottom, she found a cavernous room that stretched far beyond the chapel's footprint. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars. She stepped closer, squinting at the contents, and felt bile rise in her throat. The jars were filled with human teeth. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, each one meticulously labeled with a name. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, far larger than the one above. On it was a crude wooden idol, carved into the shape of a man with unnaturally long limbs and a featureless face. Around the idol were more carvings, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse under her flashlight's beam. Then the tapping started again, louder this time, echoing through the cavern. But it wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from the jars. The lids rattled, and the teeth inside clinked together like wind chimes in a storm. Emma's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and she bolted up the stairs, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. As she reached the top, the trapdoor slammed shut, nearly catching her hand. The chapel was no longer empty. Figures stood in the aisles, dozens of them, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were tall and thin, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Their heads tilted in unison as they turned to face her, and their hollow, gaping mouths opened, emitting a soundless scream. Emma stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering as she tried to find the door. The figures began to move, their jerky motions like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. She managed to throw the door open and sprint into the storm, her breath ragged and her legs aching. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at her clothes and hair as she ran. She dared to look back only once, and what she saw froze her blood. One of the figures stood at the edge of the trees, watching her. Its featureless face began to change, warping and stretching until it mirrored her own. When Emma finally reached her car, she didn't stop to catch her breath. She sped away, vowing never to return. But the nightmare didn't end there. That night, as she reviewed the footage from her camera, she froze. In every photo and video, she wasn't alone. Behind her in the shadows of the chapel, the figures stood closer each time, their featureless faces turned toward the lens. The final image showed Emma herself, standing in the forest, her face blank, her eyes gone. The quiet village of Black Hollow was nestled in the shadow of a craggy mountain range, shrouded by mist more often than not. Few people ever passed through, and even fewer stayed. What drew Ellie there was the promise of solitude and the affordable rent on a creaky old house at the village's edge. The landlord had been vague about its history, brushing off her questions with a shrug. "It's an old place," he said. "Houses like that have stories, but nothing you need to worry about." Ellie didn't press. She wasn't interested in gossip, just peace. The house was old but charming, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a small garden overrun with weeds. Inside, it smelled of dust and mildew. She spent the first day cleaning, unpacking, and arranging her few belongings. It wasn't until evening, as the shadows grew long, that she noticed the door in the kitchen. It was a heavy oak door with no handle, set into the floor. A trapdoor. She tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge, as though it had been sealed shut. Shrugging it off, she made dinner and settled in for the night. The first night passed uneventfully, save for a faint scratching sound she dismissed as mice in the walls. But the second night was different. Ellie was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from the kitchen. She lay in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. Another thud. And then a faint whisper, too low to make out, like someone speaking just beneath the floor. She grabbed her phone and crept downstairs, switching on every light as she went. The kitchen was empty, but the trapdoor stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness gaping beneath it. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. Silence. Against her better judgment, she edged closer, the air growing colder with each step. She nudged the door open wider with her foot, peering into the void below. Her flashlight beam illuminated a stone staircase spiraling downward. She considered calling someone, but who would she call? The landlord? The police? They'd laugh her off, or worse, think she was crazy. Taking a deep breath, she descended, the air growing damp and heavy as she went. The stairs ended in a small stone chamber, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with old tools and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a circle of stones, each one engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. At its heart lay a mound of ash, as if something had been burned there long ago. As she stepped closer, the air seemed to hum with energy. A faint voice whispered again, clearer this time. "Let me out." Ellie froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it echoed as if spoken in a cavernous space. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. No response. Just the hum of the air and a sudden, oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Something moved in the ash, a faint stirring, like a breath of wind. Then, a hand, pale and skeletal, emerged, clawing at the air. Ellie screamed and scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut and shoving the heaviest piece of furniture she could find on top of it. That night, she didn't sleep. The whispers continued, muffled but persistent, until dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight pierced the kitchen window. Only then did the house fall silent. Ellie left the next day, abandoning her belongings and driving as far from Black Hollow as her car would take her. She never spoke of what she'd seen, trying to convince herself it had been a waking nightmare. But weeks later, the landlord placed an ad for the house again, claiming it was perfect for a quiet retreat. And the next tenant, like Ellie, would hear the whispers from below. Only this time, there might be no sunlight to save them. Megan had always loved estate sales. There was something thrilling about rifling through the remnants of someone else's life, uncovering treasures long forgotten. When she heard about the old Blythe Manor sale, she couldn't resist. The estate had belonged to the eccentric Blythe family, who had mysteriously vanished decades ago, leaving the grand, decaying house untouched. On a rainy Saturday morning, Megan arrived, umbrella in hand. The manor loomed in the distance, its once majestic facade weathered and scarred. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and damp wood. Tables piled with trinkets and furniture crowded the halls, but Megan was drawn to a small side room away from the others. There, tucked in the corner of a dusty bookshelf, she found an old wooden music box. It was beautifully crafted, with delicate carvings of vines and flowers, though the winding key was slightly tarnished. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, and decided to take it home. That night, as the storm raged outside, Megan placed the music box on her dresser. She wound the key, expecting a charming, tinny melody. Instead, the music was haunting, a slow, mournful tune that sent a shiver down her spine. She told herself it was just the unusual tone and went to bed. At precisely 3 a.m., Megan woke to the sound of the music box playing. The melody was faint but unmistakable, and the key was turning on its own. She stared at it from her bed, her heart hammering in her chest. Maybe it's just stuck, she whispered to herself, though she didn't believe it. As she approached the dresser, the music stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. Her reflection in the mirror above the dresser caught her eye. For a split second, she saw movement. Her reflection smiled, even though she hadn't. She stumbled back, her breath catching. The room felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker and more alive. She reached out hesitantly to touch the music box, and the moment her fingers brushed it, the lid creaked open on its own. Inside, instead of a spinning ballerina or a figurine, there was a small, aged photograph of a young girl with wide, empty eyes. Scrawled beneath the photo in spidery handwriting were the words, "She hears you." Megan slammed the lid shut and backed away, grabbing her phone. She searched for any information about Blythe Manor and the music box. The stories she found chilled her to the bone. The youngest Blythe daughter, Annabelle, had owned a music box just like the one Megan now possessed. Annabelle had been obsessed with it, spending hours playing its eerie tune. She claimed it spoke to her, but no one believed her. One night, the entire family disappeared, leaving the music box behind. Megan's phone screen flickered and the power went out, plunging her apartment into darkness. The music box began to play again, louder this time, its haunting tune filling the room. The air grew heavy, and a faint whisper seemed to accompany the melody. "Why did you take it?" a childlike voice asked, barely audible. Megan spun around, her flashlight illuminating nothing but empty space. Then she saw it, her reflection in the mirror again, this time staring back at her with those same wide, empty eyes as the girl in the photo. The reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. Megan watched in horror as the hand pushed through, the surface rippling like water. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the reflection's hand closing around her wrist, pulling her into the mirror. When her friends came looking for her days later, the apartment was empty. The only thing left was the music box, sitting on the dresser, its lid slightly ajar. Inside was a new photograph. Megan, her eyes wide and empty, staring out from the frame, and beneath it, in the same spidery handwriting, were the words, "She hears you now." On the outskirts of town, where the roads turned to dirt and the trees grew unnaturally close, stood a dilapidated motel called the the hollow rest. It had long since fallen out of favor with travelers, but it still stood, a relic of a forgotten era. Most people avoided it, but when Natalie's car broke down in the middle of a stormy night, it was her only option. The neon sign flickered weakly as she pulled her suitcase through the front door. The lobby smelled of damp carpet and mildew. Behind the desk sat an old man with a thin, crooked smile. His eyes were unnervingly dark, as though they absorbed the light. "Just passing through?" he asked in a voice that was both gravely and too soft. "Yeah, just for tonight," Natalie replied, forcing a polite smile. He handed her a rusty key marked Room 6. "Keep the curtains closed," he added, his tone casual but his expression anything but. Before she could ask what he meant, he turned his attention back to a faded newspaper on the counter. The room was worse than she expected: stained wallpaper, flickering light bulb, and a faint but persistent scent of rot. Too tired to care, she tossed her bag on the bed and locked the door. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the window. As she settled in, something felt off. The room was eerily cold, and the air felt thick, oppressive. She remembered the old man's odd warning about the curtains and glanced toward the window. The curtains hung heavily, hiding whatever lay beyond. Ignoring her growing unease, she tried to sleep. But as soon as she turned out the light, she heard it, a faint tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate, too rhythmic to be the storm. Natalie froze. It had to be a branch or maybe the wind, she told herself. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Against her better judgment, she got up and moved toward the window. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain. "No," she whispered to herself. The old man's warning echoed in her mind. She stepped back, heart pounding, and returned to the bed. The tapping continued, relentless, like fingernails against the glass. She grabbed her phone, desperate for distraction, but it wouldn't turn on. The battery had been full earlier. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, scraping sound, as if something sharp was dragging across the window pane. Natalie couldn't take it anymore. She yanked the curtains open and immediately wished she hadn't. A face stared back at her, inches from the glass. It wasn't human, though it wore the shape of one. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over sharp bones, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. Its eyes were black pits, endless and hungry. Natalie stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat. The thing tilted its head, watching her, and then it raised a long, skeletal finger and pointed at the lock on the window. Suddenly, the glass cracked, a jagged web spreading from where its finger pressed. Natalie scrambled for the door, fumbling with the lock, but the air in the room seemed to thicken, slowing her movements. As she threw the door open and fled into the rain, she glanced back. The thing was gone, but the window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the storm. She ran to the lobby, soaked and trembling. The old man looked up from his newspaper, his face impassive. "You looked, didn't you?" he said, sighing. Before she could respond, he added, "Room 6 is always curious." I need to leave," Natalie stammered. "Go ahead," the old man said. "But it doesn't matter now. It's seen you." Natalie drove away as fast as her car would take her. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she was miles from the hollow rest. She tried to convince herself it was a nightmare, the product of stress and exhaustion. But that night, as she lay in the safety of her own bed, she heard it again. Tap, 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 this time on her bedroom window. She didn't dare look. The old road through Ravenswood Forest was known for its eerie quiet, where even birds seemed hesitant to sing. It was the kind of place drivers avoided at night, but Claire had no choice. She was late, and taking the shortcut through the forest was the only way to make it in time for her sister's wedding rehearsal. The road was slick from rain, her headlights slicing through the thick fog. She drove slowly, her nerves on edge. The trees loomed over the road like silent sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Her GPS flickered, the signal cutting in and out, but the road seemed straightforward enough. That's when she saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. Claire slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a stop mere feet from the figure. Her heart pounded as she squinted through the windshield. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in outdated clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at her. Claire rolled down the window slightly, her voice shaky. Are you okay? Do you need help? The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. He lifted one long arm and pointed down a narrow dirt path that branched off the main road. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I can't go that way, Claire stammered, unsure why she felt the need to explain herself. The man didn't react, his arm still outstretched, his finger pointing into the dark. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, plunging the road into near darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. No sound, no movement, just the empty road ahead. Claire's chest tightened as she rolled up the window and gripped the wheel. She told herself it was just a trick of the fog, maybe a stranded traveler who wandered off. She pressed the gas, determined to put as much distance between herself and that spot as possible. But as she drove, her unease grew. The road seemed endless, the same trees, the same bends, repeating like a loop. Her phone had no signal, and her GPS remained frozen. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then another. Finally, she spotted a small clearing up ahead with an old, decrepit gas station. Relieved, she pulled in, hoping to ask for directions or at least take a moment to collect herself. The gas station was eerily quiet, the lights flickering overhead. A single pump stood rusting in the mist. Claire got out, calling out for anyone who might be inside. Hello? Is anyone here? No answer. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling faintly. The interior was dimly lit with dusty shelves stocked with outdated products. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air. As she approached the counter, she noticed an old newspaper lying open. The headline made her blood run cold. Family of 5 vanishes on Ravenswood Road. No leads after 10 years. The accompanying photo showed the dirt path the man had pointed toward. Her stomach churned as she read the details. The family had taken a detour down the path and was never seen again. Locals claimed the forest took them. The bell above the door jingled, and Claire spun around. The man from the road stood there, his glowing eyes fixed on her. But now he was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice echoing as though it came from everywhere at once. The lights flickered, and the man vanished again. The shelves began to shake, cans and boxes tumbling to the floor. A deep, guttural growl resonated from the back of the store, growing louder with each passing second. Claire bolted outside, jumping into her car and slamming the door shut. She floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as she sped away. The growling followed her, an unseen force shaking the car as if trying to tip it over. When she finally burst out of the forest onto the main highway, the growling stopped. She pulled over, shaking and gasping for air. Her phone lit up, finally regaining a signal. She dialed her sister, sobbing into the phone about being late and the nightmare she'd just endured. But her sister's voice was faint, distorted. "Claire, you're not late. You never showed up. We've been looking for you all night." Claire checked the clock on her dashboard. It was frozen at 10:13 p.m., the exact time she'd first entered the forest. A glance in the rearview mirror made her heart stop. In the fog behind her, the glowing eyes were still watching.